This is part 3 of our series on how to use Ultimaker Cura for complete beginners. In this video, we are going to learn when supports are not necessary and how to reorient shapes so you can avoid using supports when possible in your 3D prints.
And so I'm going to drop in a file called shape 1, which is just the first shape we teach in isometrics. I'm going to go to isometric shapes and select shape 1. And it's just a shape that we should all be familiar with if we've been teaching engineering for any amount of time. If I slice this right now, there's no problem at all. I go to preview. It's going to break it into 190 layers. It's at 30% infill because that's what I had it set to last. I can make that smaller to save a little bit of material. It's only going to take 25 grams. It'll take 90 minutes to print. I like having these files printed, all my isometric shapes, so the kids can hold them in their hands and manipulate them while they're sketching or 3D modeling those shapes. And so I have a bucket full of them in my classroom. But I didn't know about supports when I first started doing this. And so let's talk about what those supports are and why it's important. So if I were to flip this over, and so you see I went to my rotation and I flipped it over.
Hey guys, Editing Anderson here from the future. I realized while editing this that you could not see these features off to the left that I'm using in the video. I'm selected on the rotate in this part of the video. In other parts, I will use my move feature and other features from this menu bar. You may not see all of these options yet. Just know that I added them from the marketplace, and you'll add them when you need them or when you're ready. But once I click on my rotate feature, I can then rotate this however I want in any one of these 3 degrees of freedom.
And I slice it again. It will slice it, and it will print it as is. But you can see what will clearly happen when we get up to, what layer is it, about 70 maybe? Right here. You see that layer right there? How is it going to print that layer? And the answer is it can't because there's nothing on there. And so you have to see how a 3D printer works. Can you imagine this? And so there's nothing under it to print it. So how is it going to print that part?
And to be clear, this is actually a clip of an example where you really wouldn't need supports because of something called bridging. More on this later. But I like this clip to help us visualize what the printer is actually doing, which is building off of something below it at every layer. If there is nothing under the layer that your printer is currently printing, like there wouldn't be here, then you will end up with this very terrific spaghetti mess like the one you see here.
If I had to do this, I would add what are called supports. And I want you all to see what that looks like. And so anytime you see anything red in the prepare section, it's saying, hey, you can't print this without supports, or we recommend highly adding supports. So let's go ahead and turn on supports. And so I just have regular supports everywhere usually, and I usually go with the 65-degree angle. That's usually a safe bet. Every once in a while I lower it to 45. Your printer can handle 65, and we'll talk about why in a few minutes. But I'm going to go ahead and slice this now with supports on, and you'll see why. So now you can see it takes way longer, and it takes about 6 more grams of material. If I hit preview, you'll see what happened. It's actually going to print. That's what blue things are. They're supports. It's going to print these supports, and you're going to have to break them off after it's done. We don't want that if you can help it. And so how do you fix this? Well, if I orient this another way, and sometimes there's no way around that. We'll talk about that later too. I'm going to orient it a way where I don't need any supports. Even though I have supports on, no supports will generate this time. But you can kind of see why supports are so important. So let's go ahead and get rid of shape 1 out of here. And let's go over the next thing where supports aren't needed. How do you know supports aren't needed? And so I have another file in here in the tests folder called 3D printer test. That's it. And we drop it in. Oops. I'm sorry. I should have opened it in Cura. I apologize. So I go find it in Cura, in tests, 3D printer. And it always loads in sideways. No big deal. You can just rotate it. So I click on the file, and I can either rotate it in any one of these 3 degrees, or if I hover over my rotate options, right here it says select face to line to build plate. So I'm going to click that, and I just select the bottom face, and it automatically aligns it to build plate, just so you know. Saves you a little bit of time. Okay, now you'll see there are multiple points on this that's requiring supports. The point of this print is to print without supports. It tests what your printer can do. So I will turn off supports if I'm printing this. Now you might say, well, whoa, what about that right there? Doesn't that need supports? And the answer is no, and it actually tells you the angle it's printing at. And so you'll get to see what happens when it's at an 80-degree overhang. And so if I slice it with no supports on, we can start to see how it would work. And I actually have one here too, so I'll show you what my Elegoo Neptune 3 Pro was able to do, and you'll see it in just a second. But we go to preview, and we look at the slice. You can see at the bottom, obviously, there's plenty to build off of, right? It just builds off of itself. As it goes up, you can see, well, again, at every point, there's something to build off of, right? Once we get to the bridging test, you'll see the first place where it says you have to add supports, right there. If you look at these, you'll see supports are needed under this. But your printer is able to bridge if it has 2 points of contact to go between. And so what your printer will do, will go from here to here, and think like a hot glue gun that's stringy. If it hits 2 points, you can see that string. Your filament will be that string. And so I printed this with no supports, and you can see what it looks like under these bridges. Now, unfortunately, you can't see it all that well from this horizontal angle. But what it does is it just droops a little bit. And if you don't want it to droop, that means, like, okay, add supports. If you don't mind it drooping a little bit, then it'll bridge itself as long as it has, again, 2 points of contact to go to. If there isn't 2 points of contact, what do I mean by not 2 points of contact? That's this. Do you see how it's just each layer it builds up? So if I go up 1 layer, it's just building off the side. Like it just goes a little bit further. Your printer can handle tiny overhangs. So every layer, it adds to the overhang. But you can see as the overhang goes farther and farther as an angle, the overhang is further out. And so if I just go up 1 layer now, you can see how much wider it is, right? This is where you're going to see it start to fail. And that's okay, because that's sort of the point of this, is to see what angle isn't any good. And so if we go back to the ImageMate, you can see what started to happen as it printed. You can see where it starts to fail. It still does it. It's just very droopy and stringy at the bottom because it has to be. You got to think about how the printer is printing. But so for me, around 65 degrees is where it starts drooping. And so I know that's the limit, and that's what I go with, if that makes sense. And so this is a good one just to test the limits of your printer as well. If you have the Elegoo Neptune 3 Pro, it probably has the exact same limits as my Elegoo Neptune 3 Plus. Now, what happens if I were to add supports? This just sort of gives you an idea of why you would want supports and why you wouldn't. So there are times where you can just say no supports on a file, even though you think you do. And I wish I would have known that. But you can see the problem with adding supports here. I have to break these supports off. And sometimes when you're breaking supports off, it'll actually tear up what you're printing. Let me get something that has supports on it still. And here, I've got one of my Iron Man helmets. Let me pull up my ImageMate, and I'll zoom out so you can see it. Move my mouse out of the way. So you can see, when you printed the Iron Man helmet, obviously, you needed supports to hold it up as it went. And sometimes the supports are easy to break off, depending on the situation. They just snap off. Sometimes they're actually a little bit harder to break off. So you can kind of see I'm struggling here. And so supports are necessary. But sometimes the supports are thicker than your 3D print. And so if you can avoid supports, you want to. You can hear me breaking it off, but not all of it broke off. And so I have to go in there with my flush cutters and peel it off. There are videos online on how to do it, and if you want, I can do another one next week or in later weeks showing y'all how to break off supports, different strategies. You can imagine if I broke off these supports like you just saw, how I could accidentally break the bridging itself. But on top of that, that's not the point of this test anyway, but you can imagine how I can break parts of this just breaking off the supports. And so if you can avoid it, avoid it. And to be honest, you're going to mess it up. You're going to add supports when you don't want them. You're going to print things that needed supports that you didn't put down. And it's just part of the process. You're going to have failed prints. It's just something you're going to have to deal with. But when I slice this one, I will slice it with no supports as is. So to go a little bit deeper into this, I'm going to open up another file. And so it takes about 4 hours to print this, by the way. And this is what it'll look like with no supports.
And so for our last example in this video, let's go back to our isometric shapes from earlier. And let's select all of the shapes except for shape 1, since we've already done shape 1, and hit open. And you can see it groups them all together, and I can fit all of these on one print because I have a bigger printer. You might have a smaller one, so we might not do all of them at once. We might only do like 5 to 7 or 8 at a time. And so the main point of this is I want to talk about the circles. So let's get rid of all the slanted and blocked shapes here. And then we can move some of these shapes around so they're not grouped so close together. It's not a big deal that they're grouped together as long as there's a little bit of space in between them. You can see that little gap there. But just so you can kind of see what I'm doing, if it's all so close together, you might not be able to see the shapes. Now, if I slice it as is, you can see all the circles that are going to require supports at the top. And there's an easy way around some of that. Some of them can just rotate very easily. And so I can just turn this one 90 degrees down, for example. And this other example here, you can also do. And so now those two shapes don't have those support problems anymore. I might need to rearrange this one just a little bit. But there are some shapes that no matter how you orient them, they're always going to have that support problem. So for example, if we tried to turn this one some other direction, we actually are creating a situation where it requires even more support. So that's not going to do us any good. I'm going to go ahead and hit undo. And so some of these are just always going to have that red area where the software recommends support. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Let's keep supports on at 65 degrees and hit slice. And you can see this will take about 11 hours. If we go to preview, you can see the supports that are required, and you can imagine how hard it'll be to break these supports out. And this is actually a problem that I had to learn the hard way, is these circles actually don't need supports. It turns out if you're making a fully enclosed circle going up, you can survive without supports. Let's go ahead and turn off supports and reslice it so you can hopefully visualize what I'm saying here. And look at that, it took off about 12 minutes or so. If you look at the top of a circle as it goes up, you can kind of imagine how it's going to be okay by utilizing that overhang from both sides until it gets to that top point where it starts to meet in the middle. And it actually does a pretty good job fully enclosing that circular shape as it extrudes up. And so I could actually probably send this to my printer as is, and it would do just fine in this situation. And so anytime you have these kinds of fully enclosed circles coming up, you can actually avoid using those supports while you're printing, making your life a little bit easier and maybe saving you some filament and some time. So an example where that might happen is on this Ironman mask. You can see there's a lot of places that we would absolutely need supports as we print, but not actually inside of these small circles for these magnet holes here. We could actually block those supports, and we'll talk about how to turn on supports in some parts of a print and how to turn them off in others in the next video. If you found this video helpful, do me a favor and hit that like button, and please consider subscribing. And don't forget, this video was part of a series. So if you want to keep going, go ahead and click Continue Learning. Or you can click the link to the full playlist down in the description.